And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist John Cowan. Thanks for joining us today for the marine forecast. We'll start off taking a look at the sea ice. Again, a little bit of sea ice starting to develop across the Beaufort coast. However, most offshore areas remaining ice-free so far. Most of the ice pack remains north of Siberia, and this is going to keep temperatures generally mild across much of the coast until we start to see that freeze really start to bring temperatures down. Tonight's weather, we're looking at a very deep low pressure system over Bristol Bay. This is going to continue to strengthen as it moves across the Alaska Peninsula into the Gulf of Alaska over the next couple of days. Very strong winds associated with this low. We'll see storm force, possibly even hurricane force gusts in portions of the Alaska Peninsula with this storm. Now out west, you can see the beginnings of our next storm beginning to enter the picture. And as we get into Thursday, this storm will start to move a front from west to east across the western Aleutians. We'll start off with precipitation generally being very wintry, a mix of snow and sleet, transitioning to rain as the front passes. Now back over to the Gulf of Alaska. For Thursday, our low has moved south of Kodiak Island, bringing those stronger winds into Kodiak Island and the northern Gulf. However, the core of strongest winds is again going to be over the Alaska Peninsula with those very strong winds persisting into Thursday. Getting into Friday, our low has moved off into the central Gulf of Alaska, winds decreasing over the southwestern mainland and the peninsula. However, we do start to get those stronger winds developing now over the southern panhandle on Friday, and that's going to prompt some high wind issues. We already have a high wind watch in effect for Prince of Wales Island set to begin Friday afternoon in advance of this storm. Now looking back into the Bering, our Bering storm has moved, or the front associated with our Bering storm has moved into the central Aleutians, again starting off as snow with precipitation and then transitioning to rain as a good shot of warm air comes up behind that front. So let's take a look at our marine forecast. We can see across southeast, generally looking at 15 to 20 knots or so out of the south to southeast across from Juneau down to Ketchikan. Seas generally around 3 feet, and then in the offshore areas, looking at winds generally south to southwest around 15 to 20 knots, and then transitioning out of the east as we get north towards Yakutat, seas around 8 to 12 feet. Very different forecast for Friday. As that low moves into the central Gulf, we do see some very strong winds start to develop. Along the coastline, we'll see winds 30 to 35 knots straight out of the east, seas increasing up to 12 feet for most of the coast. And then for the rest of the panhandle, we're looking at winds out of the southeast around 20 to 25 knots, gusts even up to 30 knots, seas increasing about 3 to 5 feet for those areas. Coming back over to the central portion of the coastline here, Cook Inlet, generally going to have winds out of the north to northeast, 25 to 35 knots. Seas about 5 feet near Anchorage, and then as we get south of Kenai, seas begin to increase in that 8 to 12 foot range. And then in the offshore areas, winds generally out of the east. We're looking at about 25 to 30 knots across that area, seas generally 4 to 6 feet. Now as we get into Friday with our Pacific storm, or our Bering storm moving into the Pacific, we'll start to see that increase in winds and thus sea state. Offshore of Anchorage, winds 25 knots increasing to 30 as we move south of Kenai, seas 8 to 10 feet, and then increasing up to about 10 feet for our offshore zones here. Prince William Sound staying around 4 feet or so, winds 20 knots out of the northeast. That offshore component is going to help us keep those sea states a little lower near the immediate coast. Now for the big story, moving into the Alaska Peninsula. So we have a very strong core of winds that's going to be moving across the region here. Cold Bay can see some very strong winds in these offshore zones. North of Cold Bay, we have 55 knot winds sustained. Gusts even up to 70 knots, especially through these passes. That can funnel winds and cause some really strong winds in those areas. Seas 19 feet on the Bering side, 5 to 10 feet on the Pacific side. Getting into Friday, we do see a decreasing trend as the low begins to move away to the east. So winds north to northwest at about 30 to 35 knots. Seas generally about 8 to 10 feet on the Bering side and 4 to 7 feet on the Pacific side. Getting into the western Bering Sea and western Aleutians, some stronger winds out of the south near Shemya with that next storm that's going to be moving up from the North Pacific. Winds 40 knots out of the south, seas 10 to 12 feet in that area. Over the central Aleutians, winds generally fairly light for this time of year, 15 to 20 knots or so. with seas generally around 8 feet. And then by Friday, with the front moving from west to east, we'll see those winds start to increase from the south, gusting up to, or pushing up to 35 knots west of Adak, seas up to 15 feet, and then again, the calmer conditions towards the east as we work towards Nikolsky and in Alaska. For the west coast, we'll see winds generally out of the north at 20 to 25 knots. That's going to keep seas in that 3 to 5 foot state. For Friday, again, winds relatively light, 15 knots out of the north, seas about 3 feet or so. And these offshore areas a little stronger again as you get towards the south here, where we mentioned that stronger core of winds earlier. And then for the northern portions of the state, we still have some relatively stronger west winds across the north slope, 25 knots or so, keeping seas in that 5 to 7 foot range. And then a little lighter as we get south of Point Hope, generally out of the north to northwest around 20 knots. Decreasing Friday, coming down to about 15 knots with seas in that 3 to 5 foot state south of Point Hope, and still some gustier stuff up north, Utqiagvik to Kaktovik, west at about 20 to 30 knots with seas up to that 5 to 8 foot mark. And that is all we have for our marine forecast. I'm meteorologist John Cowan. Thanks for joining us.